This is the Batfoot Podcast. Now, here's your host, Damien, David, and Matt.
Welcome in, everybody, for another season preview episode of the Batflip Podcast. We're going to talk about the Miami Marlins today, and oh boy, this is going to be a fun one. So I'm here today with I'm Matt. I'm here today with David. We're going to talk about these Marlins. So, David, how are you doing today? And what do you think of the Marlins?
Long day at work, but one of them days. I'm excited to talk about the Marlins. Unfortunately, we're recording on the day that Roki Sasaki got announced his final three, and the Cubs weren't in that group. So a little disappointed. Overall, would be my current mood of things, but definitely here to talk about a somewhat disappointing team. So I suppose my mood fits nicely with the subject matter at hand today. How you doing today, Matt?
I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. Just not excited that it's a Monday. We're recording on a Monday. I think I'll put this up on a Tuesday here, but yeah, it's everything's good. But yeah, let's start talking about the Marlins. I mean, this is a team that is 2 years removed from a playoff appearance back in 2023. It's a surprise playoff appearance on the backs of a really good pitching staff led by Sandy Alcantara. They had some other contributions, guys like Jesus Luzardo, who we'll talk about here in a little bit, on that staff, and just a team that had a lot of opportunistic play. A few good players offensively, like Jazz Chisholm was on that team, and they brought in Jake Berger at the deadline, who had a really good second half for them. Josh Bell had a really good second half after a deadline trade. So that Marlins team, they made the playoffs, and then last year they were coming into the season, they didn't add anything, and they were kind of expected to be around a 500-ish team last year with that pitching staff, but then the wheels fell off because the pitching staff got injured and the offense just absolutely collapsed. And they traded away everybody. They traded Luis Arias early in the season. They traded Jazz Chisholm at the deadline, and they blew it up again, which is the pattern of the Marlins. It's playoff appearance the very next year, blow it up every single time. So definitely, something to, kind of a tough note to start on here with just another rebuild for Miami. But David, what do you think of just kind of the last couple of years in the state of the Marlins right now?
This is as bad as it's ever been. I mean, this is going to be one of the worst teams. We went in reverse standings order, I think, in our team kind of preview, and we feel very comfortable doing our episode on the Marlins here in January because the odds the Marlins acquire someone to even improve this team, much less, make it a team worth talking about in the middle of the season is like negligible, right? Like this is kind of a disaster of a team. It's that first year of a rebuild, right? Just like you mentioned, they've sent everybody away that's kind of got any like value at this point. A lot of prospecty guys, a lot of guys that are just going to have to find their footing in the big leagues, and these are often guys who flame out and end up struggling a lot at the big league level. And we'll get into exactly who that is, but I feel very confident that this Marlins team is it's among the worst we've seen, and it will challenge it'll challenge the White Sox for worst record in the majors for sure.
Yeah, and you want to talk about teams that have like where they stand in the order of baseball. The Marlins being maybe the worst franchise right now. Outside,
Yeah.
I think I'd rather be the Marlins position than the Rockies, maybe, because the Marlins at least don't have any money on their books right now. So if they were to decide to add money to their payroll, or sell the team to somebody who will add money, they don't really have any bad contracts, whereas the Rockies have a similar team and farm system, and they have bad contracts too.
Mhm.
But I mean, I would rather be the White Sox. I mean, the White Sox at least seem to have a plan. I mean, they're
Yeah.
full blown rebuilding. They've added prospects. Their farm system is improving at a pretty good rate, honestly. Um, while the major league team is absolutely horrible, and they're a disaster. But
Mhm.
anyway, so definitely interesting. But we'll go ahead and move on. Speaking of all the moves they've made, we'll go to our addition subtractions page here, and honestly, I mean, the Marlins didn't do a whole lot. Because
No.
they had already moved everybody and they didn't want to sign anybody to a team that's going to win like 60 games. So I think the biggest thing is the two major moves they made were trading Jake Berger and Jesus Luzardo in this offseason for prospects.
Yeah, those are the two big moves, and I don't think either one of them is necessarily warranted. Now, the Luzardo trade can be explained, I believe. That's a guy with still some value. We talked about it, I mean, in our podcast discussing this trade, right? I mean, he's a valuable pitcher, but a guy that's very risky because he's had some of those arm injuries before, hasn't really eclipsed, 100 innings in his career other than that 2023 season when he was outright dominant. So you wonder whether that will continue for Luzardo, whether those struggles continue, whether that talent takes over and he actually kind of breaks out and keeps up uh, a successful season. For my belief, it's one of those things where you are a team with no money on the books and no prospects. Like this farm system is really quite bad. They've done they've made a trade, right? But Jake Berger, I think, had more value than what they sold him for to the Texas Rangers, and he's going to go in there and start for a team that's hunting for the playoffs. You could have held on to Jake Berger, I think, and
Yeah.
let him either accrue value or just be a leader in your clubhouse. He's a guy with three and a half seasons of control. His value was not going to go down, I don't think, unless he just collapsed at the plate. We've got playoff teams hunting for him, so I don't think that's going to happen. The Jake Berger trade felt pretty bad to the point that they probably could have gotten better prospects for him. It's just the value they sold Berger for, just not good. And it's reflective of how this organization is run. It's run cheaply. They try to they try to extract value, but then they do so in such a way that makes us question it. It makes national pundits question it. Everything they do becomes a question. And this Berger trade specifically is it's a big time question mark. And like, why are they acquiring this? I don't think any other moves on this slide are are almost worthy of our time here because it's, Christian Pache is a former top prospect. Matt Mervis had some run as a top prospect. Like those guys are, they're just so negligible that
Yeah.
the Marlins have no direction. And it's felt like that since, like you mentioned, since they won the World Series in 2003 and since they won the first World Series in 1997, they have been completely devoid of direction with several very several like points in their history where they've kind of all coalesced and it's all worked out. And other than that, it's been just chaos.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. One thing that I think is interesting with the Marlins is just some of these other teams we've seen, even the White Sox and the Rockies to a certain extent, have added a few guys via free agency that are like 1 year, $3 million deals that could potentially be like a corner outfield platoon that has a big half season and eventually becomes like a trade piece at the deadline. And the Marlins just haven't really added any of that. I mean, they really are. They're running right now similar to what like the A's have been doing the last couple of years, where they are literally just trying to be as bad as possible and not even trying to get guys in that will give them value for trades.
Yeah.
And I think that's really unfortunate that they would decide to do that. If you look at the additions, I mean, a Rule 5 pick, that's always a good move to make if you're a team like this. Give a guy, a chance to come be a reliever in the big leagues. You got Matt Mervis was a good pickup for them. I feel like because you didn't really give up anything, and you never know if he could figure it out somewhere else. And then these other guys, I mean, Max Acosta was a pretty good pickup in that Jake Berger trade, but he's going to be he's a prospect, and Wagaman's a journeyman minor leaguer. So just the additions haven't really been they haven't added any major leaguers really. I mean, and that's something that I would hope that over the next month or two that they might add a few, minor league free agent type guys that are, not make the big league roster and have a good half season where they can trade them and get something in return, maybe a future reliever for a contending team or something. So definitely, not the most successful offseason, although, the Luzardo trade was the biggest move. And I thought they did okay in that. So definitely kind of fits what they want to do with that trade. But moving on, we'll talk about this year's team, unfortunately. So looking at the current state of the Miami Marlins offense, which has been one of the worst offenses in baseball for a while. You look around and there's just not that much here. But I guess a few players for us to kind of shout out are, Jesus Sanchez in left field is a guy who still hits the ball really, really hard. He has never totally figured it out, but he's definitely still interesting and could eventually, he could be one of those trade pieces we talked about where he has a good half season. He hits the ball so hard he might put up 25 home runs in a half season. and gets traded for a real prospect. And then the two guys that I think are really interesting for this team are Xavier Edwards and Connor Norby. Both guys
Mhm.
are less than a year of service time. Xavier Edwards had a really good half season at the big league level, especially at the plate. David, I think, is going to talk about his defense a little bit, which was not great. But at the
Yeah.
plate, 130 WRC plus, although it was BABIP inflated, he has so much speed that he can run a high BABIP. Maybe not quite as high as he ran this year, but a high one nonetheless. And Connor Norby was the pickup in the Trevor Rogers trade, which was really heavily criticized by a lot of national pundits as being bad for the Orioles. So Connor Norby is going to be able to man third base here, and those are a few guys to really look out for that I think are going to be, maybe pieces that you look at and say, hey, the Marlins have a good player here.
Yeah, Kyle Stowers is the other pickup in that trade with the Orioles, and two of those guys starting for this Marlins team. I don't think either of these guys are necessarily ready to be starting on a major league roster right now. And that's, I think, the biggest weakness of this team. I really like Davison De Los Santos. He's penciled in here as the DH. I think that guy's going to have a decent career, maybe a Josh Bell type of hitter. He's only 22 years old, but starting off on the Marlins, having to learn how to hit major league pitching in an environment where the vibes are going to be down, right? There are no and that's where I thought Jake Berger was important. They have no mentors, nobody you can go talk to if you're struggling. This team is very incomplete. It's a lot of rookies and it's a lot of young players, like you mentioned, with very little service time, guys who just don't know how to get things done at the big league level. And I think some level of that is missing from this Marlins team. We've got Xavier Edwards projected there for 3.4 WAR, which I thought was a little high. It's the projection though. It's not me. I would not be projecting him for 3.4 WAR, but that's just what Steamer has. But that's projecting Xavier Edwards to be a positive defender. He was the worst defender at shortstop in the major leagues last year. Now, I'm not saying that Xavier Edwards can't be a good defender, but last year he was the worst defender in baseball at shortstop with a negative 10 outs above average at shortstop in his 600 innings out there. So, I mean, that and outs above average is cumulative. So that would have kept going in a negative direction if he had kept playing there for, the full 1,000 innings that a typical full season is. I think Xavier Edwards is probably more of a second baseman, maybe a center fielder if he got some time out there, but he's being shifted into this role at shortstop, and I don't feel like that's the best place for him. But there's no one else to play shortstop for this team.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I mean, if you've got a young guy like Xavier Edwards, he's 24. I think he's going to be 25 this year. He's only got a couple of years of he's only got 2 cup of coffees in the big leagues. He played 30 games in 2023, and he played 70 games this past year. Give him a run at shortstop and see if he can figure it out. I mean, he's an athletic guy. He might be able to figure it out. You never know. And you can always move him to second base later if you need to go find a real shortstop. I mean, but that other than those 3 guys, and you look at I mean, you've got just a bunch of journeymen, or Otto Lopez is kind of interesting. He was a really good defender at second base last year. He put up a 2 WAR last year, which is a little bit above his projection, but he didn't hit. And then, I mean, Conine is really a, quad A guy. Bride is a quad A guy. Stowers appears to be a quad A guy, even though he had some form of prospect pedigree. Fortes is a backup catcher, I mean, on a good team. And De Los Santos is kind of a below average DH who's a replacement level player. And although he is young and he has a lot of power, so he could figure it out and be good. He's got some potential. And then their bench
the guy to look out for. Yeah, the guy to look out for is De Los Santos.
Yeah,
he's 22. He has no major league experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a guy to look out for. There's not a whole lot to be excited about with this Marlins team. De Los Santos is a guy to be excited about, and that's rare here.
Yeah. And just a few guys to know that'll probably be up at some point. Augustine Ramirez was part of the trade for Jazz Chisholm from the Yankees in the offseason. And that's a guy who I think has a lot of potential. He's a catcher. Fortes is not necessarily just set in stone as a catcher long term for them. So, Ramirez is somebody who I think he's going to be in AAA to start the year. most likely, and I think he could challenge and take over that role at some point this year. You look at Matt Mervis. David knows a lot about Matt Mervis. He was a really big bust for the Cubs, but he was also a top prospect who has some form of talent, who maybe can figure it out somewhere else. You never know. And then some of these other guys. You look at Paulie, Cerna, Acosta, and Barry, and you just think about, like, I mean, you know, you know, the Marlins, and this is their big problem. I mean, the Marlins just don't develop guys. I mean, Jacob Berry is the name that pops out to me on the list here.
Yeah.
And this is somebody who was picked in the top 10 of the draft. He was one of the top prospects. He came out of Arizona, was an advanced college bat, and he just
Was he LSU?
Oh, LSU. I
Yeah.
think he was Arizona, transferred to LSU with their coach.
I might be right.
But he just he hasn't hit, and he's a bat first guy. So, it just doesn't. They just don't. They just haven't done it. We haven't mentioned a guy that is no longer in this organization, and Khalil Watson. I mean, that was somebody who was projected to be like a top 5 pick in the draft. He got picked like number 13 by the Marlins. Everyone was excited about that, saying, "Wow, the Marlins got a steal." And he is 2 years later isn't in the org anymore because he had maturity issues, and the Marlins didn't develop him. So, that's a big problem for them. And we'll see if some of these young guys they've got that we've talked about could be pieces for them, but. As we mentioned, Mervis, Paulie are both guys who have failed at the big leagues once, and don't really seem to be major players. For the future players for them. And Cerna and Acosta are fine, but especially Acosta is like the number 15 prospect in the organization right now. So I mean, that's just kind of where they're at in the position player market.
I will say we might be underrating Jonah Bride just a little bit. He had a 123. Possible. He had a 123 WRC plus with a 461 slug, and he was pretty good against lefties. He had a 900 OPS, against righties. He had a 900 OPS as a righty. 914 OPS, 144 WRC plus. Maybe there's something there. I don't know. It might be a little Frank Schwindelish from Jonah Bride, but maybe a little bit of a late bloomer. But that's a guy you could probably trade.
Yeah. Well, we'll move on in a second from the position player side. But the last point I kind of want to make is every time we talk about a team like the Marlins, like we talked about the Rockies, like we talked about the White Sox, they have so many guys like Stowers, Conine Bride, Lopez, De Los Santos. Somebody is going to be better than expected. I mean, the law of averages says one of these guys is going to be good, and it's going to be a bad take that we had that they aren't good. But I mean, just the law of averages, 1 out of the 5 or 6 is going to be pretty good. And Bride might be the guy, De Los Santos might be the guy. Somebody's going to figure it out, but you just can't bank on everybody figuring it out. And obviously, the Marlins are, not in a good position here on the position player side. But moving on, we'll talk about the pitching next. And this is the side that you can get a little bit excited about with the Marlins, I think. They definitely, especially in the starting rotation, they definitely still have some pieces here.
Yeah, Sandy Alcantara is still a really good pitcher. They've assured him that he is not getting traded this offseason, which should tell you absolutely nothing because the Marlins are kind of a slimy organization in the first place, and I wouldn't believe a word they said. So, take that with a grain of salt, but I assume Sandy will be in this rotation come opening day. And I mean, look at this. They got 4 pretty good starters. Max Meyer's still young. Edward Cabrera's got control issues, but has 99th percentile stuff. Ryan Weathers should be okay. They could use another starter. This is a group that, man, they could go out and get Jack Flaherty and have a decent little starting rotation, right? Like, I would bet on this rotation if they would put together some kind of offense for them. And I like this bullpen. I think there's a lot of pretty good names in here. Now, I don't think Faucher is very good in that closer's role. And Jesus Tinoco got DFA'd by the Cubs this year. That's not a guy you're projecting, I don't think, for 0.64. I think Steamer's a little off on that. Anthony Bender and Declan Cronin are both really good pitchers, and Andrew Nardi is an excellent left-handed reliever. All 3 of those guys have significant value to either a contending team hunting to, pillage this bullpen for value, or even this team, right? Those guys are they've been here a number of times. Those guys are kind of veterans of this team. I look for one of them to take over that closer role. My bet would be Cronin. I think once the season gets going, but yeah, between Bender, Cronin, and Nardi, they have a really good little core of bullpen arms. And we'll talk about the rest of these guys, and they got some injuries, right? And It's
Yeah.
just disappointing because this rotation actually has glimpses of being a decent rotation and that could field a good team.
Yeah, that's the frustrating thing with them. And you mentioned like if they had a competitive team, they wouldn't have traded Luzardo either, and you would have been able
Right.
to add him into this as well. Where you have
Right.
an Alcantara, if didn't have the injuries, you had Alcantara, Luzardo, Uri Perez, and
Yep.
Edward Cabrera, Max Meyer, and then the prospects. I mean, this rotation, this pitching is something that they can look at to the future. This is the first group of position or first unit that we've looked at in the series where you're like, man, this group could be good one day. So, but the good thing with them is that they have this pitching depth right now. You look at Yuri Perez as somebody who's really young. He had Tommy John. He should be back at some point this year. I'm sure they will take it really easy on him coming back,
Yeah.
but he should be back at some point. He's he obviously could end up being right at the top of this rotation with Sandy, and then the prospects. I mean, Adam Mazur and Robbie Snelling were really big pieces of the Tanner Scott trade that we really bashed the Padres for that trade last year as being an overpay.
Mm-hmm.
Dax Fulton's a really interesting prospect, and then they have Noble Meyer down in the low minors. And
Mm-hmm.
what you can do is you can use Sandy and Weathers and maybe a Meyer or something, Cabrera. It's one of those guys. You can flip those guys for prospects, and then you have this young crop of pitching that can come up and kind of come up at the same time and be like the 2015 Mets when you had DeGrom, Syndergaard, Matt Harvey all kind of come up in a similar time frame within 2 or 3 years of each other and be like an elite rotation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you could see that with the Marlins in a few years if they kind of go through that path. But as we've seen with the Marlins, there doesn't always seem to be a plan here. So we'll see if they go with that plan. That seems to be kind of what they're doing right now, but we'll see if they actually stick with that or if something changes, which is typically what happens. And then she mentioned the bullpen, I think is pretty good. There's some names there. There's some interesting pieces. Um, Calvin Foucher was actually really good last year. He had a 3.19 ERA in 53 innings.
Yeah.
I don't know that he'll back that up again, but they're not totally barren in the bullpen. So they'll probably play a lot of low scoring games, and I think their pitching staff will keep them in some games.
Yeah.
So on that note, moving on to the outlook for the 2025 Miami Marlins, we have an over-under win total of 63.5. So David, what do you think? Over under 63.5.
I have to take the under because, and I'll give you my exact reasoning why I think Sandy Alcantara is not
Yeah.
on this team come July. I think Ryan Weathers is probably not on this team come July. I would wager Edward Cabrera is probably not on this team come July, and all three of the relievers that I said I liked not on this team come
Yeah.
July. So if what I would say is probably 6 of the top 8 players on this team are not on the team come July, they're not winning very many games.
Yeah.
I think they'll bank some wins before that. I don't think they'll
Yep.
challenge the White Sox. I think they'll bank about 50 wins
Yeah.
and get up to about 60. But they won 62 last year, and I think this is a worse team than what played for them throughout all of last year. So,
Yeah, because at the start of the year they still had Arias and Chisholm, and
Yep.
They were still
Yuri.
had pieces last year. Yuri, even though I think he got hurt really fast, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean I'm with you. I think I'm going to take the under. You got to remember too, this division is absolutely loaded at the top
Yep.
with the Braves, the Phillies, and the Mets, who are all World Series contenders this year. And then the Nationals are a little bit improved. Their farm system, that they won't be too far from now on our list of season previews, but their
Yep.
farm system has started to come up from the low minors to the upper minors, and they're getting better. So, the Marlins are going to have a really difficult season this year, in my opinion, and I think that they will go under the 63.5, especially after some of those trades. The rest of their odds make the postseason plus 2,000. I mean, the only reason they're not higher than that is because there's a ton of playoff teams. The odds to win the NL East are plus 25,000. They're not going to win 162 games be better than the Braves, the Mets, and the Phillies. And the odds to win the World Series are actually the same as their odds to win the NL East, just because I guess the chances of getting in the wild card and making a run are higher than the chances of them actually winning over 162 games. So definitely, definitely one of the lower tier teams. But kind of to wrap us up here, David, what do you think? If we're going to have if the Marlins have a successful season, what do you think that means this year? Because it's not going to be winning the World Series.
To me, a successful season is, and one thing we didn't mention and I'll throw him in now, is they changed managers, right? They fired Skip
Yeah, that's right.
Schumacher,
Or he
which
walked.
uh, they kind of, I think they mutually agreed to part ways. There was some
Yeah, he didn't want to be
weird
back
stuff.
there. He did
Yeah,
not want to be there. So
but
I think it was kind of like, well, if you don't want to be there, then you're fired type thing.
yeah.
But yeah,
And they got Clayton McCullough, he's coming over from the Dodgers. I think he was the Dodgers' first base coach. Um, so a successful season to me would be, I would say, exceeding that win total, right? If you get 64, 65 wins with this group, I think you're doing well. My assumption is that they need to win some of those trades, right? They need to they need to pick up in the farm system, right? Draft well this summer, dedicate a lot of resources to drafting well here. You're picking, I'm pretty sure they're picking pretty well in the draft. They
yeah, they
need
should
to
be.
nail some of these trades. They've got some guys with some value. Hit on those trades. You've got to find a way to regenerate some enthusiasm in this organization with young players. You're not going to go out and spend the money. I wish they would. You and I both wish they would. Miami's a massive market. This should be a powerhouse team, and it's not. And that part of that is ownership. Part of that is the location of the ballpark. But for me, if you're going to succeed in 2025, you have to set the organization in a direction that is going to take it on a path forward, right? And typically what we're seeing with the draft lottery and stuff, it's hard to continually lose. So you need to be targeting guys someone in the upper minors, right? Double A, triple A. I'll tell you, trade Sandy to the Cubs, get 3 top 100 prospects. That's a really good way to start. I'm just saying. I'll leave with that.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you. I think just kind of have some of these young. I think success for them is a couple of these young position players, Jacob Berry, Xavier Edwards, Connor Norby, these young guys who are just getting to the big leagues, who were kind of just not sure about two or three of them breaking out and just really being a piece to kind of build around in the future. I think that's something that the Marlins haven't had in a while, is a position player to build around. I mean, but those teams back in the early 2000s, that were good, late 2000s, like they had, Miguel Cabrera, a position player to build around, was there on their 2003 World Series team, and a couple of pretty good Marlins teams after that. They had Hanley Ramirez years. They always had somebody that was like, okay, if you're gonna, at least he's watchable,
Right.
and they haven't had that in a while. I mean, we thought that might be Jazz Chisholm, but he just ended up not really taking it to the next level with the Marlins. He dealt with injuries a lot. We thought maybe Arias, but his upside's just so limited with his skill set that he's just not going to be a superstar. He's going to be a good player, but not a superstar. So I think, I think that's one big thing. And then, of course, as you mentioned, I mean, just hit on your trades, draft well. They have the 7th pick in the draft, which is
Yeah.
probably not quite as high as they would hope for. They're behind the Mariners, which is kind of crazy. The Mariners have the 3rd pick in the draft, even though they were like a game away from making the playoffs last year. Welcome to the draft lottery era. Of course, it's not as bad as the White Sox who have the 10th pick. But
Well, they couldn't. They picked top 5 with that was the rules, right?
yeah, and the Nationals have the number 1 pick.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see. We'll look forward to watching the Marlins this year when they play our teams.
Yeah.
But
But beyond
but
that,
yeah, but on that note, we'll wrap it up here, and appreciate everybody for watching us. We will be back with another episode soon. Not sure which team is next. I believe it might be the Angels, but I'm not 100% sure. We're kind of going in order of World Series odds. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and we appreciate it.